Hello, students. This is your instructor, Dr. David Russell Mosley, for the class The Theology of the Trinity. So I have read through all of your forum discussions on our first week on Thomas Aquinas. And so before we begin this second week on Aquinas, I wanted to address several of the issues that kind of cropped up over and over again in the discussion. So, this lecture, just so you know, is likely to be a little longer than usual because a lot of things came up, and I think it's important to address these before you begin reading Aquinas again for this week. So, with that being said, let's begin. So, several of you, I think, struggled with what you called the vocabulary, the issues that Aquinas, the foundational structure that Aquinas is using, and so I wanted to try to address that a little bit more in this lecture. So this is things talking about, say, matter and form, generation and procession, substance and accidents, etc. So it's the first kind of block of things that I want to talk about, and then we'll go on to some other issues as well. So first, as I said in my lectures about Aquinas from last week, what we're dealing with here is kind of a rediscovery of the works of Aristotle. And so Aquinas is using these newly translated works of Aristotle to find new ways to talk about theology, new ways to talk about God, and new ways to kind of organize theology. And so one of the things that came up that seemed to cause some confusion are the issues over matter and form in Aquinas. So what I want to address specifically is just what these things mean. So matter and form. For Aristotle, and therefore for Aquinas, all things, and specifically for Aquinas, all created things consist of matter and form. So matter then is the stuff out of which something is made. In our case, flesh, bones, muscle, blood vessels, etc. That's our matter, right? That's our stuff that we're made out of. Matter also generally includes the shape of something, and that's important because then everything that has matter has to have a form. And form doesn't mean its shape necessarily. It doesn't mean like the way it looks. But what it means is the thing that kind of lets us know that it is A, not B. So for us, our soul, and specifically the fact that our soul is rational, is what gives us our form. That's how you know that we're a human being and not, for instance, an ape. That's the difference. That's the distinction. Or at least it's one way of distinguishing, is our form. So when he's talking about God and matter and form, what he's essentially saying is God is not a created thing. God doesn't consist of matter and form because if he did, then he'd be created like us and wouldn't be God. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. Please do let me know if it doesn't. The next thing that I want to talk about is another kind of duality in Aristotle, and therefore in Aquinas, and that is the issue of substance and accident. So this one, and I believe I talked about this in the lecture last week, but to try and hammer it home a bit more, when we're talking about, there's two things that probably need to be brought up first. When we're talking about substance here, we need to temporarily forget how substance is used when we're talking about the Trinity. So, in the first week, for instance, we talked about the word consubstantial and how it's the same, essentially, as homoousios, of the same substance, of the same nature. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about substance in an Aristotelian sense. Here we're talking about what a thing is. So in this case, we are human beings. We're made up of body and soul. That is our substance. Accidents are things that modify a substance. So another way to think about it is, a substance is like a noun, right? Like human or dragon or tree. Accidents are like adjectives. They modify the substance. They modify the noun. Okay? So, if man, let's say, is a substance, then a green man would modify. The word green modifies our noun man. Or green is something accidental to the man. Right, so that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And for Aquinas, God can't have any kind of accidents, nothing, because an accident modifies the substance, right? It changes something about it. It's no longer just a man, it's a green man. And so there can't be anything, if God is simple, if God is who Aquinas says God is, then there can't be anything that modifies him, that changes anything about his nature, about his substance. Okay? So even when we talk about God being triune, that's part of his nature. That's not accidental to who God is. But if we were to try to say something else about God, that something else is accidental to him, then we'd be saying that something can modify God. And this is something that actually Augustine hits on when he talks about the incarnation. Because Augustine notes, it's in Book 4, I can't quite remember exactly where off the top of my head, but it's in Book 4, where Augustine talks about how when lesser cleaves to greater, it does not change the greater. And there he's talking about the humanity of Jesus. So when human nature gets joined to divinity, divinity is in no way lessened. It's in no way modified. The substance of God is in no way changed or modified by adopting humanity. In fact, the exact opposite happens. It's the humanity that gets changed in that situation. So in some strange sense, God works as both substance and accident in that instance, because God is the substance, he is the source of humanity itself, and yet he is modifying that humanity by uniting his divinity to it. Okay? So if that's as clear as mud, feel free to post something in the questions forum or to send me an email, whatever. Okay, now I want to talk about generation and procession, because I think this tripped up several of you. So, Aquinas, when he's talking about generation, he's certainly not talking about like baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, millennials, etc. He means to generate something, to bring something about from something else. So here we're talking essentially about the same word as that Augustine and Gregory tend to use in the English translations that we read, which is beget. So what Aquinas is saying is that the Son is generated. He is coming about. He originates in a generative kind of way out of the Father, out of God. And the reason I backed off on Father there for a second is because that's something we're going to talk about more this week. But the point being that the relationship, the way that the second person of the Trinity relates to the first person of the Trinity is like that of Son to Father. And fathers generate, they beget sons. Not only, obviously, but that's the language, that's the relational language that we've been given to talk about God. And here again, we come back to this whole notion of substance and accidents, which is to say that being Father isn't accidental to who God is. It's not something that he could still be God if he weren't Father. Not for Aquinas, not for Augustine, not for Gregory. If God is Father, he is Father eternally. I know that we've talked about this before, so I feel a bit like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's so very important when we're doing Trinitarian theology. Okay? The question then for Aquinas becomes, does the Spirit originate from the Father, or, as Aquinas will argue, from the Father and the Son in the same way? And Aquinas' answer to that is absolutely not. Because then we would have two sons, or two offspring anyway. And yet, that's not what Scripture teaches. That's not what the Bible tells us about God. So we need to find another word that does describe the relationship. And the word that, again, Gregory, Augustine, and Aquinas all settle on is the word proceed. In the translation of Gregory that we read for this course, the older translation, they use the word emit and emission, but it means the same thing. And so for, alright, so I'm getting things a little backwards here. So we call that a procession. The key for Aquinas is that we can also talk about how the Son proceeds from the Father, but the way the Son proceeds from the Father is a generation. The way the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son is different. Okay, it's not the same. And I feel it's important here. I can't quite remember if I talked about this in a previous lecture, so it's important to go ahead and just mention this here. For Eastern Christians, primarily for the Eastern Orthodox, the Spirit does not proceed from both the Father and the Son. Not in terms of origination. The Spirit only proceeds from the Father for Eastern Orthodox, though he does proceed missionally from the Son. And that's important because we're going to talk about missions and relations more this week in Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so just to rehash that for a moment, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, as I talked about last week, in the way that love proceeds from a lover and the beloved. That's what we're talking about when we talk about procession. And when we talk about generation, we're talking about begetting. We're talking about son to father, a filial relationship. Okay? So again, any questions, feel free to ask them. One thing I wasn't going to bring up, and then I dawned on me that perhaps we should talk about this. While I did absolutely talk about this in the lecture on Who is Thomas Aquinas last week, which I highly recommend that you look back over if what I'm about to say was an issue for you, though I will rehash some of it here, is how to read the Summa. A couple of you, I think, got very confused as to what Aquinas' actual position on certain issues was, and you got confused because you thought the objections were where Aquinas was putting forth his answer to the question. That is not the case. So again, the way the Summa is laid out is we have a general question that we're answering. Then we have various articles putting that question in kind of different ways, looking at different aspects of that question. Okay? So question, article. Then within each article, he objects to what he will give as the answer. He gives the objections first. Why, for instance, God does have a body rather than doesn't have a body. Okay? He provides those first. Then he gives his answer. He gives the but on the other hand, and then the I reply, or I answer that. God does not have a body. And he explains why. Then he replies to the objections. He shows why the objections that were given are not adequate. On that front, A couple of you also were wondering where the objections came from. Ultimately, the objections, in one sense, in the most direct sense, came from Aquinas himself. He kind of made them up, if you will. And this is ultimately good persuasive paper writing. When you write particularly an extended project, it's always good to, when you have your thesis, what you're going to say, it's always good to keep in mind, okay, well, what are some objections people might raise to this? Right? Why might someone not agree with my thesis? And then you explain why they might not agree, and then you explain why they're wrong to not agree. It's exactly what Aquinas is doing. Now, where ultimately those objections came from can be one of several different places. In some instances, he's going back to earlier church heresies. For instance, when he's dealing with Arianism. In some instances, he picks out misreadings, sometimes from heretical groups, and sometimes from groups that aren't intending to be heretical, that is, aren't intending to do something different. They're just reading a text and they get it wrong. So he, if they read, say, what we'd normally, a church father, someone like Augustine, and get him wrong on an issue, misread his text, or say the Bible. Others of them are going to come from students. So I believe I discussed this in the original Who is Thomas Aquinas lecture. But to go over it again, so often in medieval classes they would have various different ways that a class would be conducted. One of those would be under what's called the disputatio, that is disputation. And basically it would be, the class would start with, okay, we're going to pose a question, and now let's go through the answers, the potential answers to this question. And so that was a normal method of teaching in the Middle Ages. And so it's almost kind of what we would call playing devil's advocate, taking up the opposite side of an argument from what's generally accepted in order to have a better argument for what is generally accepted. Okay? So some of these might come from, sorry, I keep bumping the table. Some of these might come from classes that he had taught at the universities at which he had taught. So this brings me then to a very important issue, which is one called, C.S. Lewis gives the name chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery is the assumption that we today know and do better than our forebears did. And often this doesn't mean people who lived 20 years ago, or it doesn't mean our parents' generation, or our grandparents' generation, or our great-grandparents' generation, but it means like people in the Middle Ages, or in the ancient times, or and so on and so forth all the way back. Western history, since probably the 19th century, has very much pushed what we would call a progressive view of history and of mankind in general. That is, we assume that we are just getting better, right? That everything about human society today, everything about humans today, is progressively getting better. We had old farming techniques that used oxen and horses and cows and so on to plow fields, and now we have tractors and combines and so on. Or before, people used to cut people and bleed them to make them feel better, to heal them of certain diseases. Now we know that's a bad idea. And in some cases, modern practices are better than medieval or ancient practices. But not always. And we can't always assume that our own understanding of things today is inherently better simply because it's our understanding of things today. And this has come up a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, particularly with Augustine, but also now with Aquinas. Someone brought up, that Aquinas didn't have up-to-date biology, physics, etc., etc. As if that kind of excuses Aquinas from not being understandable on a certain point, or it's like, look, it's okay. Aquinas didn't know about X. He didn't know that the Earth went round the sun, etc. We have to be so careful when we talk like that, for several reasons. I mean, for starters, just in the sciences, science inherently as a discipline is constantly proving itself wrong. So take for instance the notion of a heliocentric versus a geocentric universe. That is, a universe at which the sun is at the center, or the Earth. I mean, for starters, for Copernicus, for Galileo, etc., it was a heliocentric universe, not even just a heliocentric galaxy. Point being, they still thought the sun was the center of all things, which now we know there's this great big universe, and so far as we know, our sun is not at the center of the universe. But even there, that's so far as we know, because we don't know everything about the universe. Take physics, for example. I would potentially argue that a medieval's understanding of physics are more in line with modern understanding of physics than Newtonian and post-Enlightenment physics in general. And that has to do with quantum physics and other things that we don't have time to get into. But the point being that the sciences are constantly proving themselves wrong. Or especially today, the sciences so cut out all variables to try and get at kind of laws behind things that they leave other things behind. To try to give an example of what I'm talking about here, but not to belabor the point too much, a show that I really liked for a long time on the Discovery Channel was Mythbusters. Great show, fun times. I love seeing, things explode and whatnot. But in several of the myths that they deal with on this show, I always notice, they try to follow things scientifically. They try to cut away all of the variables in order to understand what may or may not be happening. Unfortunately, the only real example I can think of has to do with lighting a match and the smell in a toilet. They conclude, after they basically, what they do is they take all of the gases that comprise what stinks up a bathroom, and they present fire, a lit match, to each of those gases to see if it in any way neutralizes the scent. They conclude that it does not, that there's no one of those gases that the flame just somehow magically makes the smell go away. Whether or not it's true, it doesn't matter, but what they don't take into consideration is that maybe it isn't one gas plus the flame. Maybe it's the combination of all of them. And so I only point that out just simply to say that when we start removing all the variables in science to try and get at, laws, what we get at are laws that only work out in very specific instances. So, and I'm saying all this just to remind you that our knowledge is not complete, and we've perhaps not even actually been progressing. I mean, sure, we have medicines and stuff that kind of help people live longer lives, but often quality of life is significantly low, if non-existent, even though quantity of life is attained. But even granting that, granting the fact that, I had a son. I have two sons. There they are behind me. When they were much smaller, they're going to be 2 next month. Our second-born was diagnosed with cancer at 8 weeks old. Now, yeah, in the Middle Ages, he would not have made it. If it weren't for modern medicine, he would not have survived. So there are real advances that have been made. On the other hand, we've also significantly advanced in our ability to kill people. We have developed bombs and robotically driven or remotely driven planes to deliver those bombs to kill large amounts of people at once. So wherever we may have progressed, we've certainly regressed just as much, if not more. And I say all that because it's so, so, so important to remember when we read ancient medieval authors. We can't come at it with this attitude of, oh, isn't that quaint how they thought X worked? Oh, isn't it quaint they thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe? Aren't we so happy that we know so much better now? Especially when we're dealing with theology, but just generally, that's a horrible attitude to come at ancient medieval authors with. We need to allow them to teach us. We need to give them the benefit of the doubt. We need to place the burden on our modern notions as to why they're better than ancient or medieval ones. Okay? I feel like I've beaten that horse pretty well dead. There's only one more thing that I wanted to address, and this was a question posted in the questions forum by one of your classmates. And I'm going to read the question out. Since it was posted publicly, I hope the student won't mind. I won't name him, even though you can look it up still. I want to read this question out. So they wrote, why can't it be that God is capable of interacting in our world with a physical manifestation of himself? Kind of like Jesus, but just all of a sudden appears for whatever purpose God is working with, instead of being born and growing up like we do. He certainly appeared to wrestle with Jacob in the forest, did he not? So, I think this question was being driven by the way Aquinas is talking about how God doesn't have a body. That God is not a body. Because it's not just that God doesn't have one. Angels don't have bodies, per se. But God is not a body. He is not put into motion, as Aquinas argues. And that's the key point there. When Aquinas is talking, again, all of what we've read this last week, especially from question 3, is that God is not a created being. So that's first and foremost, that's the thing Aquinas is getting at. God is not a created being. God is being itself. God is the creator. God is the one who has set everything into motion. Okay? That's the key to that question. Now, to answer the rest of this, yes, God can manifest himself. In fact, we have a word for that when it's not the incarnation. We call it theophany. That is, God appears as something physical. Not only do we get an account of Jacob wrestling with an angel, whom he then identifies as the Lord, we get Abraham. When Abraham makes his covenant with God, he cuts all the animals in two, and then a giant boiling pot passes between those things. We get many instances. In fact, the icon behind me, this one here, is called the Rublev Trinity. It was painted originally by Andrei Rublev in the 17th century, I believe. 16th or 17th century, I don't quite remember. Anyway, when it was painted, unimportant. So this is meant to be an Old Testament manifestation of the Trinity. These are the three angels who visit Abraham before going on to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. They are, the church fathers often identified these three angelic visitors as theophanies of God. That there we see the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit presenting themselves as three angels. So yeah, of course God can do those kind of things. The incarnation, however, changes everything for us. course, again, it doesn't change God. And that can lead us to some really interesting theology that sadly would have to be reserved for a class on Christology. But the key here is that now God has united himself to creation. Before Jesus Christ, God appeared in many ways to people, and probably through many created beings. There's always the question of, is the angel of the Lord the Son? Because he's the only angel to whom people bow down, and the angel doesn't say, no, don't bow down to me. So it's an interesting and important question. But it's at least possible that that angel was serving as the voice of God in that moment. And so even in the New Testament, we get Paul talking about how Moses received the law from angels on Mount Sinai. So somewhere along the line in Jewish history, did the account in Exodus transition from God himself writing out the Ten Commandments to angels doing so at God's command. So, of course, God can and still does work through any created being that he so chooses, and could, and perhaps still could, appear in a theophany, appear to anyone. Again, you might think of the dove at Jesus' baptism. But, and this is so important, now we have Jesus Christ. Now God no longer has to appear as a creature, no longer has to appear in creaturely form. He has taken it into the divine life through the Son, through the uniting of the Son to humanity in the incarnation, in the one person of Jesus Christ. And that changes things for us. It means that God, to a certain extent, no longer needs to appear in some kind of theophanic way, because now we have our nature has been united to God in Jesus Christ. So it's not a question of whether or not God can appear in any form that he so chooses, but it is a question of, does God have a body? And there are two ways to answer that question now. On the one hand, no, of course he doesn't. God is not a body. God doesn't have a body. God is not created. He is uncreated. On the other hand, in the Son, God does now have a body. God is now both created and uncreated, and has lifted up created nature insofar as this is possible to uncreated nature in Jesus Christ. Okay, this has been a very long lecture, and you've got more reading this week than you did last week. Thanks for bearing through this with me. God bless, and I look forward to seeing your forum posts on the relations and missions of the Trinity. One last reminder, there are still a few of you who haven't gotten your paper topics to me yet. Please, please, please do so. It's not so much a question of me allowing you to do something, it's just I want to know in advance what paper topic you've chosen, so that I know that you're at least thinking about it before the papers actually due. Okay, God bless, and I will talk to you all later.